Russian shadow fleet ships and Chinese cargo ships have been involved in the cutting of undersea cable and power lines in the Baltic Sea. All countries that have a Baltic Sea coastline are in NATO with the exception of Russia. Russia and China have denied any role in the cutting of the undersea cables and power lines, and if they did, it was purely accidental. The NATO countries in the region are accusing Russia of using hybrid warfare in the Baltic Sea as a reaction to NATO's support for Ukraine and its war against Russia. If Russia is involved in hybrid warfare in the Baltic, which appears to be the case, it is clear that NATO and Baltic countries are struggling with how to react to Russia's activities. There is no internationally recognized definition for hybrid warfare, or whether it should be classified as a form of grey zone tactics. NATO defines hybrid warfare as: hybrid warfare entails an interplay or fusion of conventional as well as unconventional instruments of power and tools of subversion. These instruments or tools are blended in a synchronized manner to exploit the vulnerabilities of an antagonist and achieve synergistic effects. NATO adds the additional context. Hybrid warfare below the threshold of war, or direct overt violence, pays dividends despite being easier, cheaper, and less risky than kinetic operations. NATO countries have stated that Russia is committing acts of hybrid warfare, such as pushing refugees to the Finnish border to test the asylum laws of the country. Estonia has accused Russia of moving border buoys on the Narva River, which divides Russia and Estonia. Russian intelligence and cyber attacks across NATO countries are suspected of using drone swarms in Norwegian waters or delivering exploding packages. This is in addition to the cutting of undersea cables and power lines. The challenge for the Baltic nations and NATO lies in the fact that these attacks seem to be part of a pattern that has significantly increased since the Ukraine war, suggesting that they are not a coincidence. The problem lies in hybrid warfare, which provides the suspected nation with a significant degree of plausible denial that either state actors or non-state actors executed the attacks on behalf of the state. Many of these attacks in the Baltic countries are suspected of being carried out by Russia, and it is not a stretch to accept that it was Russia responsible. But proving it was a deliberated act on the behalf of Russia is an entirely different matter. The other challenge for NATO involvement is the question of hybrid warfare, using the NATO definition. Is it truly warfare? NATO's definition is that it is below the threshold of war or direct overt violence. While it is easy to accept that hybrid warfare aims to disrupt and, at its extreme, destabilize society, it falls below the threshold of warfare. NATO has intensified its patrols in the Baltic, involving Finland and Sweden, the newest members of the alliance, who have added a total of 5 warships to serve as a deterrent against further damage to the undersea infrastructure in the region. Meanwhile, Germany has deployed a naval ship to track a suspected Russian Shadow Fleet tanker that has lost its steering control in the sea. Russia possesses approximately 200 Shadow Fleet tankers, with one suspected of severing cables in the Baltic by dragging its anchor in the past month. Germany is currently monitoring one of these tankers, which poses a risk of running aground and triggering an oil spill in the Baltic's closed waters, despite the West's awareness of the Russian Shadow Fleet's use to circumvent oil sanctions and have used only minimal efforts to slow this Russian practice. The question for NATO is whether it has a legal role in the suspected use of hybrid warfare by Russia, given that hybrid warfare, by definition, does not fall under the purview of warfare or Article 5 protections. This is not to say the suspected Russian actions are a figment of the imagination, as the preponderance of evidence seems to support, at a minimum, that Russia is a party to these attacks. Since these are not kinetic attacks, but rather acts of sabotage or other criminal acts, they fall outside of military jurisdiction and are therefore outside of NATO. There is an example of how the US prefers to handle hybrid warfare and grey zone tactics in the Western Pacific. The US supports its allies in the Western Pacific and supports the policy of freedom of navigation based on the Western accepted international laws of the sea. China asserts a significant portion of the South China Sea, a claim that the US does not acknowledge. However, during the Obama administration in 2013, the US warned China that any of its claims or actions must be a law enforcement function managed by the Coast Guard, and the dispute should not become militarized by using naval forces. For the most part, the Chinese, the US, the Philippines and Japan have honored this. NATO navies in the Baltic Sea appear to be ineffective in preventing hybrid attacks, as they lack the ability to enforce laws against civilian ships, particularly those not involved in kinetic attacks or piracy. This is unless NATO wants to assume offensive actions or a blockade against the Russian ports in the Baltic. That would require Article 5 approval, which it will not get for such actions. The national navies, acting outside of NATO jurisdiction, can serve a support role unless a Baltic country wants to take offensive action against Russian civilian ships conducting suspected hybrid attacks. This is most likely not going to happen either. Either European countries or the European Union should enforce or add laws to enable their police, state prosecutors, or coast guards to conduct law enforcement actions, such as stopping, seizing, arresting, and prosecuting suspected vessels causing infrastructure damage on Russia's behalf. If Russia protests these moves and militarizes its actions, NATO, of course, has a role. However, until that time, NATO's role is limited to vigilance against Russian militarization and escalation outside of hybrid warfare. Countries clearly find it difficult to manage hybrid tactics and grey zone tactics, as evidenced by their experiences in the Western Pacific and the Baltic Sea. Unless the response is to immediately escalate to military power to stop such activities, which has already been rejected, the issue needs to be handled as law enforcement functions, diplomatic matters, or narrowly focused but intentionally effective economic sanctions for entities or individuals involved that use international borders of friendly governments to evade law enforcement action and prosecutions from the West. This approach lacks the satisfaction of seeing naval ships patrolling the high seas in search of perpetrators, as their impressive appearance belies their ineffectiveness in such actions. Unlike the current sanctions regimes against the Russians, the use of law enforcement or sanctions against hybrid warfare must be aggressive and not half-hearted. Otherwise, why bother?